The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMZ.
Hi, everybody, and welcome again to Humanity First. My name is Peter Evers, and I am the host of the show. And today we are going to have a conversation about July in politics, and one of the most amazing months that I think I have ever lived through in terms of President Biden's debate, his stepping down, Kamala Harris becoming the new running mate without a primary. And then, of course, the Trump assassination and where that leads us. And, you know, a month is a long time in politics. And so we are going to have Dean Spiliotes, who is the civic scholar and faculty from SNHU, and our old favorite Chris Ryan is going to come, and we're going to talk about what that means for the election cycle coming up. So we'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm an essential worker here at BAMZ, and I'm a nurse. Nurses are essential here at BAMZ because as nurses, we really have the opportunity to make an impact. We have very small ratios, so we have the opportunity to really learn everything about the person served and be able to give the best care. It really serves such a great purpose for me as being a nurse and really why I came into nursing. Learn more about nursing opportunities at bamzjobs.org.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMZ.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Humanity First. As promised in the preamble, we have two guests who are not foreign to our radio program. We have Dean Spiliotes, who is the civic scholar in the faculty at SNHU. And I often think, Dean, you're always popping up somewhere on some radio show, giving amazing sort of analysis of politics. So we're very glad to have you on the show. Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm happy to be here, Peter. Always enjoy dropping in on the show.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And of course, Chris Ryan, who is a regular to the show and somebody that I've worked with for many years. And, you know, it's funny, Chris, I was looking through on the internet to find some information on you. Not that I don't know everything about you already, but it was funny because I saw something that said Chris Ryan is the modern day manly man. And I
That's
thought,
true.
Yeah, that kind of fits with you, right?
I wrote that, and I will own that.
But of course, Chris is the host of New Hampshire Today and has been for a couple of years now, I would have thought. And so we have an artillery of opinion here, and I guess I will kick it off by making the statement that I took 2 and a bit weeks off in July, and I went back to the UK, where they were celebrating the end of an election over there. And you know, what I was struck by was that the Prime Minister of the UK went to the country, that's what they call it, and there was a 6-week period of frenetic debate and advertising, and then the election happened, and it was over, and there was a peaceful transfer of power, and there was no argument. Actually, it was a landslide for the Labour government. But there's some issues came up about proportional representation, given that the far right Reform Party would have had a number of more seats had they looked at proportional representation. But what I was struck by was the lack of acrimony and ornery individuals arguing with each other. And I know that we have a reputation in England of being more demure, but if you watch C-SPAN and the House of Commons, you probably would disagree with that. But what an amazing month July turned out to be. And I'm just interested, did you see this coming? And maybe let's start with Biden. And so Biden is getting ready for his debate. He takes some time away, does a lot of preparation, and Trump does nothing and sort of rocks up to the stage. And anybody who is Democratic leaning would probably have switched the television off after about 10 minutes, I would have thought, because it was so excruciating. Dean, maybe I'll start with you. Didn't we know this? Didn't the Democrats know that this was going to be a shambles?
That the debate would be a shambles?
Yeah.
Not necessarily. They were coming off of what people viewed as a generally strong State of the Union performance. Now, President Biden has not done a lot of open press conferences. He's been fairly limited in terms of his exposure to the White House press corps in the grand scheme of things, in comparison to a lot of other presidents. So, and Chris can tell you, I've always been very careful on his show to distinguish between physical limitations and cognitive limitations. I know lots of people in their 70s and 80s who have significant physical limitations, but are sharp as tacks, as the saying goes. And so for a long time, what we saw was Biden, he has that very stiff gait, kind of a gaze, sort of slow movement, et cetera. But in the limited environments in which we saw him, he was okay or good enough. And my dictum, and it's not just me, most political scientists will tell you, you don't mess with an incumbent going into a re-election campaign. It simply serves to weaken that incumbent. So up until the debate, if you had asked me, and Chris often did, I would have said, he's the one who brought you to the White House. You got to stick with him. After that debate and what I saw and what a lot of other folks saw, it was the first time where I said, okay, this is not just physical. This is also at some level cognitive. Whether it prevents him from doing the job of president, maybe, maybe not, but certainly would make it very difficult for him to run a vigorous re-election campaign. So after that debate, my view on the whole situation changed pretty rapidly, as it did for many other observers.
Yeah, it's always it just reminded me of that. The facts don't matter in this. It's the appearance. It's how things look to people in the electorate, and that didn't look good.
Didn't sound good either. That was the big problem. Yeah.
No, it didn't. And yet there is a record over the last 4 years that has been relatively good. If you look at the economy, if you look at the things that people care about, yet this issue of inflation has just been hanging around. And really, folks have been unable to deal with that. Chris, how about you? I mean, did you? You and I have talked about this a little bit before, and we've talked about the possibility of, or what the plan was here. Was the plan that Biden would be here for 4 years, that then he would hand the reins over, and then a new person will come along. One of the things that I heard Deval Patrick say the other day, and I think I agreed with him a little bit. He said, I don't like the way it happened in terms of this handing over of power, because people didn't get a shot. Biden said, I'm here for 4 years. People were gearing up to run. Biden said, I'm running. He doesn't run. And then there's no debate. There's no race. It's just a sort of handover of the baton. And even the teams that were working with Biden have moved across. Has he got a point there?
He does. And, I think that a vigorous primary process is really, really important. And, we were, deprived of that. Biden had floated the fact that he was going to be a transitional president, and that he was going to then open up, that opportunity for someone else. He decided not to do that. And let's be honest, 2020, he was just good enough to win. He was a shadow of his former self as vice president, and also, his time when he had been the U.S. Senate run for president previous. So he was good enough to win in 2020. The question was he going to be good enough in the debates, the big time moments, this time around? And there were signs, particularly in the trip to Europe, the event on Juneteenth, and also if you watch his appearances on a consistent basis, that Biden was perhaps further in decline than he had been previous. But there was still a notion, given, as Dean mentioned earlier, that once he gave that State of the Union address, that he would be able to find it in a key moment. Because as Dean has noted, as individuals get older, very often certain things may fail, but when it comes time to do what they've always done, they're ready to go. And so I assume that it was time for Joe Biden, a politician, he would be able to show up and do that in a bright moment. But the debate was a disaster because he could not lay out a key argument against Trump. He could not defend his own record. He could not basically finish sentences and talk in a coherent fashion. And at that point, it became is this individual still capable of being president of the United States? So it was an individual that was capable of being president, or capable enough in Donald Trump, versus somebody that individuals viewed as not being capable. So the policy stuff that you were talking about, out the window for most people. For any swing voter, they were looking at and they're like, okay, Joe Biden is no longer capable of being president. Therefore, I am not going to vote, or I may even vote for Donald Trump. And when that deal was done, it was time for the Democrats to make a move just for a game change. And I don't think that, a lot of people anticipated how much support Kamala Harris would have this early. But as we'll talk about, that was also something that was predictable given how folks were so dissatisfied with the Biden-Trump choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it sort of resonates because I was around at the time, although I was in a different country. But when Reagan was reelected, there were similar questions about that, right? And at the same time, Reagan was able to surround himself with people who, depending on your political opinion, managed to get through that, despite all of the bad things that happened. And I think there is some truth that in that politics is about self-interest a lot. And I guess about 2 months ago, I was in Washington and I had a meeting with Senator Warren, and she came into the room and we were talking, and she said, Joe is going to win. There's no question about this, which of course you'd expect to hear that from her, and that we're not turning back and this is the way we're going. Fast forward to 2 nights ago, and she's weaving this narrative that this was the best thing that could have happened. Of course she's going to say that, but there's some degree of lack of loyalty in that, or maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe that's me just reacting to that. Dean, what do you think?
I think to some extent politicians say what they think they have to say in order to maintain equilibrium. So there was a whole coterie of politicians around Joe Biden who were willing to go on TV and say he's still our guy. He can do it. You should see him when we're in meetings. He's really sharp. He's in command, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe they had different thoughts privately. We're never really going to know for sure. But in the end, it's all about kind of the party and the institutions, and the individuals kind of come and go. You see that especially if you've been doing this for a long time. People who were sort of key leaders in either party are no longer on the scene, and there are new people taking their place. So to some extent, everybody says kind of what they need to say in order to maintain their spot in the pecking order, and in order to maximize their options for whatever comes next. So, the stuff that we heard about Joe Biden, you have to kind of expect that. But you can also sense the tremendous relief from a number of these individuals. And they'll always begin by saying what a fantastic president they believe Joe Biden was, et cetera, et cetera. He's a great man, selfless. I remember when he said he was just going to be transitional. I remember thinking he's going to walk away after 4 years. Nobody does that. I remember George W. Bush. Yeah. I remember George W. Bush at the end of his presidency with like 30% approval. People saying like, do you think you just kind of overstayed your welcome? And he said, no, it's the greatest job in the world. So I never really thought he was going to walk away. But he hung in there maybe a little bit longer than perhaps he should have with the whole re-election bid.
Right. And Bill Maher, actually, I was watching the other day, and he called it a Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I see,
which is no small thing. That Ruth Bader Ginsburg decision,
huge.
For as much as people revere her, it led to an outcome that they're not happy with.
Yeah, which will
not only that, Dean, but when you think about the conversation now around the Supreme Court, and as well as term limits, a lot of that has to do with Ruth Bader Ginsburg as well. The notion that a justice or a president is incapacitated and unable to make decisions for themselves is not something that sits well with the American people, regardless of all the political dynamics that exist.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. That decision, or that series of decisions that were made when she wasn't very well, is going to live with us for a couple of generations. Just going back a bit to July, and you think about the bigger political events that have happened, especially in the Middle East, and we're about to understand what retaliation means over there again and again. But I suppose the biggest thing, and again, I saw this when I was out of the country, was the assassination attempt on President Trump. Extraordinary. I mean, the rest of the world looking in on that, it must have been amazed at what was happening. Because to think that that could happen to a presidential candidate with a lack of attention from Secret Service folks is almost unthinkable. And the outcome is extraordinary as well, isn't it? He gets clipped, he's on the floor, he gets up, he sort of lifts his fist, he's got blood coming down his face. I mean, it couldn't have happened better in a way. Of course, there was an awful tragedy in the death of someone, but that seemed to me at that time to change the election. And of course, there's another twist to it, in a way that I thought, well, that's it. He's in. He is going to prevail because this is further underlying this sort of He-Man, I don't take no crap kind of thing. And I mean, how did you feel about that when you saw it? Did you feel that we were sort of devolving into anarchy or something?
Yeah, it's interesting, Peter. Chris and I have talked about this a couple times on his show. I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s, and back then, some major politician was either assassinated or shot at every few years. RFK, MLK, George Wallace. I remember Gerald Ford being shot at twice,
Yeah.
and of course, I remember the Reagan shooting very clearly when that happened. So it's one of the reasons why the Secret Service has built such an incredibly protective bubble around sitting presidents. And there's some debate over whether former President Trump had the resources he had asked for. He had a pretty significant detail in comparison to some of the other former presidents who are not quite as obviously not running. He's running for re-election, and he's been a little bit more controversial. And that'll all be kind of ironed out in the investigation. They'll figure out exactly what happened. But it was a remarkable thing to see. I remember watching it being like, oh, wow, I remember that. I remember what that feels like now to watch that happen. And it can be transformative. It certainly was for Reagan for a while.
Yeah.
Things have played out increasingly curiously. I mean, it played out very briefly for Trump, where Democrats seemed kind of flummoxed in terms of how to deal with him because they didn't want to transgress any social norms. But that didn't last all that long, basically until his acceptance speech. And now with Kamala Harris shaking things up, it seems almost like that was months ago, even though it was just a little while ago.
Yeah. Harold Wilson once said, who was Prime Minister of Britain, that a week is a long time in politics. I think a few hours is a long time in politics.
It's amazing.
So so all of that happens, and then and I heard one political commentator saying on the Friday before Biden stepped down, or moved away from the race, there will be a decision where he will step down by Tuesday, and obviously people knew by that time. How do you think the Democrats were expecting the bump that they got from Harris, given that she has been sort of hidden away and given some awful jobs like going to the border every now and again? Are either of you surprised that this bump is happening, Chris?
I think I am surprised that it's happened so quickly. I thought that once the introduction took place and we started to get close to the convention, I thought that the poll numbers that we see now are going to be in place. So that makes me wonder again, like where is the peak for Kamala Harris? Because that peak is going to be after the convention, you would assume, unless there's more days for Trump, like we saw the other day at the Association of Black Journalists event in Chicago. So it is ahead of schedule, but I did anticipate this becoming a dead heat prior to the convention, just because of the fact that people, despite Kamala Harris's approval numbers not being great, independents and Democrats were thirsty for something new. There was a transactional relationship that existed with Joe Biden, and the transaction had expired.
Yeah.
He was no longer able to fulfill his obligation to independent and Democratic voters. So with that has come an incredible excitement for Kamala Harris. It's been, certainly a honeymoon period for her. And we'll see what happens once the narratives start to perhaps change a little bit with the media. There's more of an intense scrutiny, but I think she's largely going to be, defined by external factors when it comes to post Labor Day. And I think that people have asked, well, what is going to be her level of blame for quote unquote hiding Biden's condition. And I only feel that there will be blame to her because I do think she has some wiggle room from a lot of the Biden policies that may not be as popular as others. Only blame will be assigned to her if something really bad happens and people can say, well, Biden still shouldn't be president because he is in a situation where he can't deal with these issues. And Kamala Harris perhaps should have stepped up and done something to stop him from, still being president of the United States. So I think that her rollout has been really good. She has kept things brief. She has accentuated her strengths, not really shown any weaknesses at this point. And, that's the best that you can ask for when you're introducing yourself to the American people.
Yeah. So nicely put. Now we're wrapping up now, but Dina, maybe last word on this. It's really queered the pitch of the Republicans, hasn't it? Because suddenly the age issue is flipped. Suddenly there's J.D. Vance is picked as a running mate, and I don't think it's working out in terms of what he said in the past. He's alienating people who don't have kids. He's not the person he was when he wrote Hillbilly Elegy. Do you think that's all going to be in her favor going forward? The fact that this is so late that the Republicans are going to have to shift like this and find a new way to attack?
Yeah, I mean, there probably is some benefit for her not having had to go through a months long, primary process. Sometimes those primary processes can toughen you up as a candidate. In general, I think in most cases it's positive, but it can also weaken you a little bit. I think there's been such kind of surprise that Biden actually stepped aside that I think Republicans are still trying to figure out how to deal with Kamala Harris. And, really since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, she's become much more active as a spokesperson. And I think she just seems stronger now and more comfortable and relaxed in front of the podium than she did maybe 2 years ago. And I think that's to her benefit as well. Vice presidential stuff can be helpful on the margins, but in the end, you're picking between two potential presidents.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, and we've run out of time. But I am expecting that they'll take a different tack, the Republicans, than criticizing her for a laugh or maybe calling her the DEI candidate, because that shows that there's a big gulf in understanding about what's going on culturally in this country. And so we'll see. It's going to be a defining moment one way or the other. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on the show as usual. It's been wonderful.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.